Welcome to our Profiles in Leadership series. The series offers an unparalleled opportunity to glean insights from top leaders who serve in government, education, the private sector, and civil society. In each episode, we invite these leaders to reflect on their journey and share skills, core values, and qualities that make them the leaders they are today. I'm thrilled to have Mike Madison with us today. Mike is Professor of Law and John E. Murray Faculty Scholar at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. Mike writes about institutions and governance. He is the co-founder of the global research network titled The Workshop on Governing Knowledge Commons. He is the co-leader of a virtual think tank on the futures of the professions, globalization, and higher education titled Future Law Works. And he is the co-host and producer of the Future Law podcast, which explores the rapid changes to law and the legal profession produced by their intersections with contemporary technology. And we'll be including links to all of these in our video description. Today, I want to focus on leadership and in particular, the seminar that Mike put together called Technology, Law, and Leadership Seminar. So why don't we start there? And Mike, tell us what was the genesis of the seminar?
Wow, so that's a great question. I'll try to give you the abbreviated version because the full version would take up the whole podcast. So I have been teaching this seminar at the University of Pittsburgh for 3 years. It will be 4 years starting next fall of 2023. But I have been teaching a course on leadership at Pitt's Law School for about a dozen years, since about 2010, 2011. So the first number of years I taught it as a volunteer course. It was an extracurricular activity for students and an add-on for me. So there was no academic credit for anyone. It was simply something that I felt was important and some students felt was important. And then more recently, it got converted into a regular academic program. The genesis—
Wait, so you were doing this for free?
Yeah, for about 10 years.
Oh, well done.
Winter in Pittsburgh is cold and dark and boring. And so I created this originally as an evening course in the winter because it was something else for me to do to stay warm and active. And it was a way to bring some students back to the law school in a different environment.
Good for you. Anyway, continue. You're saying the genesis.
The genesis of this was that for about 15 years, beginning in 2005, so almost 20 years ago now, I was very active as a volunteer leader in the alumni community at Yale University, where I got my undergraduate degree. And American professionals and lawyers will recognize the idea of university alumni very quickly. Graduates of universities elsewhere in the world operate in a somewhat different environment, right? University alumni or graduates of universities outside of the US don't necessarily have an ongoing connection or affiliation with the university where they got their degree. But American universities, that's very common. And I was very active in the alumni community at Yale. I ended up becoming a chair of the board of the Alumni Association at Yale. And this is all important because during my service at Yale, beginning in 2005, we changed the orientation of our alumni association. So we decided to take it from its classic orientation as a mostly social group with some spillover purpose in supporting fundraising for the university and turned it into a service project. So this was the first university in the world to undertake a new identity. The idea was that Yale has roughly 170,000 living alumni around the world, both its undergraduate programs and its graduate and professional programs, about 170,000 of very, very smart, ambitious, talented, interesting human beings who could be put to use if they were interested as volunteers in service projects where they live, whether it's in the US, Europe, the UK, Asia, Africa, Central America, wherever you are as a Yale graduate, you could be organized to help deliver healthcare, entrepreneurial services, education, all kinds of different things. Whatever people have talent in and wanted to contribute, they could use that Yale identity to find fellow Yale graduates and then improve their community. To do that, you don't just find the people, you have to train them to be effective leaders in their communities. Right, so this is not something that the university was simply going to provide as part of its educational program. We had to provide it as part of our alumni relations programming and strategy. So I helped build a leadership development curriculum for my fellow Yale graduates, and it was very successful around the world.
Why does leadership matter so much to you? It's atypical for a law professor to be thinking so much about leadership.
Well, so in my Yale identity, I wasn't a law professor. I was just a graduate of my university who wanted to help make the world better. It's a very idealistic sensibility, but my original connection to leadership had nothing to do with my law professor career.
So then connect the dots and tell us how that leadership mentality interest got transposed into the classroom at Pitt.
So we built this program in our alumni world at Yale, and I thought to myself, while we're doing this, why limit this education? Why limit this program only to graduates of Yale? Why not bring it back to my law school? Why not share it with my students at Pitt Law School? Why not create a mechanism where everybody can get access to and train in these ideas of leadership? You don't have to be at Yale to be a leader. You can be a leader or participate in leadership thinking wherever you are.
Right. So that actually brings me to the question of how leadership in a simple, useful, and usable package looks like. And pardon the pun, but unpack that package for us and tell us what comes to mind when you think of simple, useful, and usable.
So that phrase comes from the last part of my syllabus for my seminar, where I'm trying to wrap up a lot of moving parts and a lot of different concepts in a small number of easy to use, easy to take away strategies and tactics for my students or for anybody who reads the syllabus. So how do we just take a very complex field, reduce it to 3 or 4 easy to remember, easy to use concepts in day-to-day life?
And I should mention for our viewers that this syllabus is actually available on Mike's webpage for free and to all, no paywall, no firewall, no password, and you're welcome to look at the details, which we'll put into the video description as well.
Yeah, as much as possible, I want to share this content with everybody who is interested. I don't want to limit just to my students. But this useful package idea is to say, okay, if you are interested in leadership and you don't have the time to dive in, or you can't remember all of the complicated moving pieces, here's a couple of quick things that everybody agrees can be useful to anybody, wherever they are, as a junior person, a senior person, a formal titled leadership role, or simply trying to do the right thing in their community or in a volunteer organization or in their job, right? So the big ones are be open to connecting with people, right? That's pretty easy to remember. It doesn't require that you be extroverted. It's perfectly, people who are introverted or identify as introverts can cultivate this as a skill, right? Be open to meeting and getting acquainted with new people, not just people in your organization, or not just people in your own department, or not just people in your class or in your wherever you live. And you don't have to force yourself on people, but just be open to the idea that people will come into your world and you should be interested in them in good measure. And ideally, they're interested in you. And sometimes it turns into nothing. Sometimes these are contacts that come and go. You chat with somebody in line at a restaurant or at the gas station or on the train or something, and you have a pleasant conversation and off you go, and you never see that person again. But once in a while, a short conversation turns into a longer conversation. Once in a while, being open to other things allows you to explore unexpected pathways, interests that you didn't know that you had, or that you didn't know that somebody else had, and a flicker of light, bubbles up, the mixed metaphors, and it matures into something. And maybe it matures into something soon. Maybe it matures into something over a longer period of time. Maybe it matures into something that is purely social. Maybe it matures into something that's more collaborative from a career or professional standpoint. So that's
It sounds like what you're encouraging there is to embrace serendipity.
Serendipity in part, but serendipity is an interesting concept, because oftentimes to take advantage of serendipitous conversations or encounters, you have to have a kind of presence and awareness and preparation. So serendipity doesn't just happen, which is kind of a paradox, right? It's fortune favors the bold sometimes, but also fortune favors the prepared in a way. So being in the right place, being in the right context, right? A community context, an organizational context, a classroom context, a volunteer context that is structured to enable openness, that allows new people to come in, that allows you to float around socially, at least, to encounter other people, a willingness to ask questions, good questions. Like, for example, in my class at the end of the spring semester, in this leadership class, I spent the last session of the semester spending time with my students saying, what do you do for fun? Nothing to do with legal training, nothing to do with careers, nothing to do with graduating from law school or moving on to take the licensing exam. It was simply, what do you do for fun? I got some really interesting answers to that question.
It seems to me, and I'm glad to hear that, it seems to me that people sometimes are reticent to share something about themselves. It's fine to talk about the weather, it's fine to talk about politics. When you ask them, what do you do for fun? And then you're peering deeper into their lives. And I think that's connected to connecting with people. You somehow need to be willing to let people in order to make that connection.
Right. So what I say to people in this leadership class is that we think of leadership as being at the top of some organization. We think of leadership as running things. We think of leadership in a lot of stereotypical ways. But leadership really begins with self-awareness, right? The willingness to scrutinize ourselves and to be thoughtful about who we are. Leadership is not only what we do, leadership is who we are, which is not something that originated with me. I'm borrowing that from a lot of people in sort of the leadership studies area. But that really means that you can't be an effective collaborator, an effective partner, an effective agent of change or transformation unless you're fully open to understanding your own strengths and weaknesses. And as you say, it includes being open to the idea of influence, right? Sharing some of yourself with others.
And who would you say has had the greatest influence on your views on leadership?
Well, I'll give a couple of examples. One, in the domain of people whose careers were dedicated to practicing and studying and talking about leadership, is a woman named Frances Hesselbein. So Frances Hesselbein, who passed away only very recently, she was more than 100 years old. She's a legend in the change management and leadership studies community. She made her name in the 1970s as the head of the Girl Scouts of America, a volunteer organization, service-oriented organization, educational-oriented organization that she rose to the very top of and utterly transformed the vision and value of the Girl Scouts in a positive way. So much so that she was later awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She was invited to be a leadership consultant at the U.S. Military Academy, aligned with Peter Drucker, the super famous management guru. Frances Hesselbein was a native of Western Pennsylvania. She grew up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, very modest beginnings, and got involved in the Girl Scouts as a young parent because they needed somebody to run the local Girl Scouts chapter. She did not have a daughter. She had a son. But the Girl Scouts called, they needed somebody, and she signed up, and she went to the top of the table utterly transformed that organization, and her vision and mission about leadership really has taken root. The idea of leadership as service, leadership as a calling, right, which really speaks to how leadership ideas and concepts get anchored inside you, and then you express those. Frances Hesselbein used to say, this was her motto, to serve is to live. Right? So it's a way of being. It's not simply a way of doing. So I always focus on Frances Hesselbein. She, at the end of her life, she had a very strong affiliation with the University of Pittsburgh, which turns out to be completely coincidental that I am here at this university and she had this strong history with Pitt. But I'm inspired by her history and her words and her vision.
But good luck, by the way, for that background behind you, because for viewers that are not familiar, that's the University of Pittsburgh right there. It
is. And that behind me on the background is the chief administrative and classroom building of the University of Pittsburgh, which we call the Cathedral of Learning. So Frances Hesselbein is one example. The other one I just want to mention very briefly, because it's much more personal to my own story, is a soccer coach that I had when I was in high school. So I played soccer, or football to the rest of the world, growing up in California in the 1960s and 1970s. For international viewers of this podcast, that makes me a very unusual American, because I've been actively involved in football for more than 50 years. And I was a varsity soccer player in high school, and we had a very small school, so we had a very mediocre team. But I had a coach my junior year of high school. We had a coach who was a very unusual coach that I've always remembered, and I love to talk about, because the thing about our coach that year is he knew nothing about soccer. He was not a soccer coach. He came from the world of American football, American rules football. He was a very successful American rules football player. He was roped into coaching our team because we needed a coach, and he volunteered. He wasn't much older than we were. We were all 15, 16 years old. He was probably 23, 24 years old. So we didn't know he was so young, but he was very young. Here's the thing. He didn't know anything about the sport, but he was a fantastic coach. He was my favorite coach of all time, because he was relentlessly enthusiastic about our potential. He could put the right number of people on the field, right? 11 people on the field, 1 goalkeeper, 10 people to kick the ball, right? He got that right. He understood the point, put the ball in the goal. Everything else was enthusiasm, not uncritical enthusiasm. It was, in our faces, let's go kind of enthusiasm, but he was relentless with that. And here's the thing, and it's important to note this last part, this man was born with no hands, right? His arms were sort of surgically rounded off just beyond the wrist when he was an infant. He went on to be an all-star football player as a linebacker. He led his college team in interceptions, which just, I remember, it's a college football player with no hands who was catching the football at a record pace. He could tie his shoes. He could play the trombone. He could drive a vehicle. He drove us to games with his, he had no prosthetics. He just figured it out. And the whole point was that he understood that his role was to inspire us to teach ourselves how to be better. And so to me, that is a really impressive and important emblem of successful leadership. His coaching was not about him. His coaching was about us. The coaching was helping us see that we could achieve, and then providing the means and the support to allow us to do so.
And talk a little bit more about that. What is at stake with good leadership or bad leadership?
Yeah. So when I talk about this with my students, there's 2 levels of what matters. One thing that matters is ensuring that my students today have all of the tools and skills and abilities that they need to thrive in a very complicated, rapidly changing professional world, right? Simply having technical knowledge as a lawyer is not enough, right? The world is moving quickly. The world is changing rapidly. It's global. It's technological. People are going to bump around from career to career and job to job. And having a good inventory of leadership skills, which includes vision, strategy, collaboration, emotional intelligence, all of these different sides of things that I talk about in my seminar, it's a really critical foundation to have at hand from the beginning in order to thrive. So I want to give my students the ability to be their best selves as lawyers. So that's the small scale stakes, because it's what matters to them individually in the moment. The large scale stakes, which I don't dwell on in my class because it's more abstract, but I think in this conversation it's very important, is this: how does law matter to the world? How do lawyers and judges and civil servants, et cetera, how do they matter to the world? 50 years ago, 100 years ago, we, meaning the legal profession generally, we could almost take for granted that law was maybe the most important system to help societies and governments function effectively. We're speaking especially of Western democracies, but that's been kind of the idealized version of the US in particular, and how the US has tried to express the idea of law, the rule of law, the idea of equal justice and so forth, right? Law is in the middle of things. What we've seen in the last 20, 30, 40 years is that through globalization, through finance, through technology, law is one of many social systems that are competing for authority, for trust, for legitimacy. We've got, artificial intelligence being the most recent competitor in this sweepstakes. So leadership skills and placing leadership on the explicit agenda for lawyers and lawyering and the legal system is a way of rounding out a modern picture of what law can do, right? If we think about lawyers in American society 100 years ago or 150 years ago, 150 years ago, lawyers were central to American society, right? Citizen lawyers, in government, in local communities, like lawyers were the public identity of virtue and order in a good way in American society. And we don't occupy that space any longer, right? Who's going to step up and how with legitimate moral voices, legitimate authority, humanity in a very, very meaningful sense in a world that right now is being pulled apart?
So would you say that this is a missing piece in our legal education?
Yeah, absolutely.
So why don't we see more law schools having this?
Path dependence, right? Most law schools, and when I say most law schools, I mean not only most US law schools, I would include law faculties outside the US, because I've spent a lot of time in the last few years talking to deans and faculty outside the US. Law schools are creatures of habit and tradition, just like the legal profession is a creature of habit and tradition. Law schools have a very fixed view of the function of law schools, of the history of law schools, of the capabilities of law schools. And on the whole, leadership is talked about, but it's not on the agenda, right? Look around your typical law faculty and you will not find somebody who specializes in studying or practicing or teaching leadership.
Right. So I was going to say to the viewers, go download a copy of Mike's syllabus and try to implement it. But you might have the software. You also need the hardware. You need the folks with the skill set and the inclination to teach. And how can we get more of such people into the classrooms around America?
Well, the easy way is to find partners and allies and colleagues in the community, right? So we have graduates of our law schools who have been practicing leadership in different sectors, in law firms, in companies, in governments, in nonprofit organizations, in volunteer sectors. They might not be practicing it as lawyers, but people that we know from our own communities have leadership experiences. They might be senior people, they might be junior people. There's typically a much more diverse range of these people than we stereotypically assume. So look beyond the usual suspects, but bring those people to the school. Make sure that they're on board with whatever the faculty member's vision of leadership is. There are multiple visions of leadership that make sure that your guest is going to say things and talk about things that are aligned with what you want to talk about with students. But bringing guest speakers to class, making a seminar or a semester's experience out of guest talks is absolutely an easy thing to do. I very much enjoy bringing guest speakers in when I can. I typically, for myself, I do not limit myself to lawyers or legal practitioners. I have a colleague at the University of Pittsburgh who teaches leadership and talks about leadership with the students in our School of Pharmacy. Turns out that the pharmacy profession is full of challenges and opportunities, just like the legal profession is. Why? Global, money, automation. So teaching leadership to pharmacists has the same function as teaching leadership to lawyers. So I bring my pharmacy colleague to my law students and have an interesting cross-disciplinary conversation. Next year, I anticipate bringing in a senior journalist. I went to my undergraduate program with a woman who has had a really striking and remarkable career as a journalist and an author in New York. And she's written several books, and I'm going to have her come and talk about career development, change management, inventorying yourself, self-scrutiny in a productive way, just to show my students that their education is not only about law and lawyers, that there's a lot to be learned by talking with people who have related experience in other fields.
So all that is good in terms of training students and giving students that experience. Wonderful. Training the trainers, that's the second level. Maybe you should start an academy, Mike, just between you and me.
So I do have I have a lot of interest, as you know, in the large-scale reform of legal education and law schools at a large level. And so one of the ways in which I put my own leadership experience to use is trying to find people around the world who share my ambition for large-scale reform of legal education. So I have a working group of people, and you can put this link, on the website with everything else. The Future Law Works entity, which is a group of volunteers. That's what it is right now. I've got a mailing list of about 200 people, law professors, deans, legal tech entrepreneurs, some law firm lawyers, some judges, some younger, earlier career people, as well as more senior people, trying to continue to expand this and diversify it. But I'm convinced that it is mostly impossible to take a current law school or a current law faculty and change it through internal reform to make it more responsive and resilient and relevant in the current economy. I think what we need is some brand new organizations. So maybe a kind of a leadership academy for legal leaders, law school deans and managing partners and chief legal officers and general counsels who are not only trained as good managers, there's plenty of training around for managers, but really trained in the arts of leadership, right? Vision, strategy, listening, collaboration, resilience, emotional intelligence. These are all elements of a package of leadership. The idea that your mission as a leader is to help other people succeed, right, is something that you don't hear about very much.
So if you're interested, I'm talking to the viewers and listeners. If you're interested, please sign up or contact Mike. If you're interested in funding these efforts, contact Mike too. Now, so leadership is hard work. Talk to us about the hard work of leadership.
Well, there's only so many hours in the day. So it's both practically difficult in the sense of I have a day job, right? I do scholarly research. I write books and journal articles. I do all the things that professors in any field do. I teach classes, I mark papers. I have committee meetings. I sleep at night. I have a family. So finding time to focus on leadership means taking time away from other things. It means making this topic a priority and making some other things a lesser priority for certain periods of time. The other thing that's hard about leadership is that it is at times emotionally difficult, right? So the idea of scrutinizing yourself, being open or vulnerable to change and to criticism is difficult. It requires a degree of self-confidence because you may hear things about yourself that you're not necessarily eager to hear. And you have to be prepared to hear those, and you have to be prepared to learn from those. And people have different perspectives on all of that, and that's fine. Again, knowing yourself means that you're not everybody is going to step into the same role with their leadership portfolio. But it's a different kind of emotional engagement than teaching a class or writing a journal article or supervising an organization as a manager.
Well, speak for a moment about that, the filtering process, whether as what you teach or whether it's something that you apply personally. There is criticism that is deserved, and there's criticism that's not deserved. So how do you distinguish between the two?
Well, the first thing I would say is that it's unwise to take that responsibility solely on yourself. Right. So probably the most important first thing that anybody does using the leadership perspective is to find friends and allies and partners, people you trust to talk to in an open way, so that if responses and criticism are directed your way, you're not in the position of trying to determine their validity by yourself. Right. So do you have a sounding board? Do you have an advisory team, even just an informal advisory team, people that you know and trust, people who sort of think like you and who you know how they think of you? I can't stress enough how important that feature of leadership is. Oftentimes it's behind the scenes. It's not that you are parading these people around. But you really, at the end of my syllabus in my seminar, I have a link to a podcast episode. I have my students listen to podcasts and watch videos. There's a podcast where Abby Wambach is interviewed by Brene Brown. So Brene Brown, it's a pretty well-known podcaster, scholar, author at this point. She's actually really smart and delightful, but she was interviewing Abby Wambach, who many people will know as the former star of the US women's national soccer team, one of the most famous and successful US women's national team players ever. And now that she's in retirement, Abby Wambach is out there, as an entrepreneur, as an inspirational, motivational speaker, and doing all kinds of things. And Abby Wambach has this line in the book that she wrote and in speeches she gives about her wolf pack, which is her clever little metaphor for find your people. Like as a leader or in a leadership role, or if you have a leadership sensibility, find your people, which, it's a social activity. It shouldn't be a solitary activity. And if you're successful in rounding out your team of people, your wolf pack, to use Abby Wambach's term, then you can process criticism. You can process responses more effectively. You can figure out what's merited and what's not. You can figure out what to do productively with the feedback that you get. You can figure out how to include people who are responding to you rather than be defensive about the criticism.
And how do you find these people? Because I hear and personally experience it to be true. The older that you get, the harder it is to make the same kind of close friends that you might have in college and so on, where there are these rites of passage that you go through together.
So back to where we started the conversation about being open to connection. I agree with you. As you get older, it is harder to build deep friendships because you don't have those sort of, furnace-like intensive social experiences you do when you're young. But not all of your team, not all of your people, not all of your wolf pack need to be close, intimate friends. It's perfectly legitimate and actually valuable sometimes to have different layers of social support for where you are, what you're trying to do. So you might have some people that you're closer to, and those relationships or friendships might come from longer time ago or deeper, more intimate kinds of experiences, but you might have looser affiliations. You might have professional connections in your school or in your department or in your organization. You might have neighbors that you see in a volunteer capacity or in a congregation or some setting that's not necessarily directly related to your self-imposed leadership identity, but people who you sync up with, people who you trust because you have just validated their experiences and your conversations with them in a more of a loose ties way, rather than a strong ties, or a weak ties way, rather than a strong ties way. And it's important as a leader or using a leadership sensibility to be aware of the different kinds of connections that we have in the world and how to combine different kinds of connections into what we might call a web of support rather than a granite base of support.
But what it sounds like is, and I think a lot of people, including myself, have not really appreciated is there's a lot of introspection that's required in being a good leader. Now, how do you build that skill of introspection? Is it meditation? Is it taking long walks? Well, speak of it personally and then more generally, if you like, based on the literature that you've read.
I think it's a combination of being comfortable with learning to get comfortable with yourself. So long walks, hikes, whatever your comfort level is with different kinds of things. For a long time, most of my life, I've liked to go for long, slow runs. So for people who walk or hike, you all know that being out there by yourself and alone in your thoughts can be a very, very generative and productive way to get a lot of great thinking done when you're not surrounded by computers and smartphones or TV or whatever, and so forth. So that's one thing to do. The other, again, I keep coming back to the social feature of this. Right? It's important to learn to get comfortable with people who are going to challenge you. Right? It's tempting to surround ourselves. When I say, your wolf pack, your people, your web of support, it's tempting to imagine that all of those people are there to simply say, you're great. You're wonderful. And it's obviously wonderful to have people who will do that in our worlds, but it's also important to be open to the idea that some of your closest supporters and most helpful colleagues are people who will push back on you. So I told the story about my being involved in the Yale alumni world, starting around 2005 and getting more responsibility through that. How did that activate my interest in leadership, and how did I internalize that? How did I bring that back to Pittsburgh? The answer is when I started my volunteer career at Yale in 2005, 2006, the university had hired a new executive director for the Alumni Association. So this very energetic, very inspirational guy with a great career in fundraising out there in the world. And he's a Yale graduate. He came back to the alumni world and he walked into the boardroom in New Haven, and we're sitting around a big table, about 30 people. We all met this guy and lots of energy. Welcome to the team, brand new guy. And he basically looked at all of us with the board of governors of the Yale Alumni Association. It's very elite, self-important group of people. And he said, you people are here spending a lot of time and your own money, and you're sitting around a table and you're planning cocktail parties. Like, what a waste of your time, of the university's time, of your talent, of your opportunity in the world. Like, the opportunity cost associated with that group of alumni leaders in that room at that moment was enormous. And the first thing that this guy did, and his name is Mark, and he's my great friend and mentor at this point, first thing he did is he called us out. Like, you're wasting everybody's time. Most importantly, you're wasting your own time. Like, whoa, we just sat right back. And some of the people in the room did not like to hear that. And they gradually, over a few months, they kind of floated away. But some of us were really engaged by that. Some of us took that as a charge, as a mission, to like rethink who we were, to rethink why we were there. And honestly, if that organization had continued to be purely social and planning cocktail parties, I wouldn't have stuck around. Like I got charged up. Like I kept going back because I liked the idea of changing myself, changing my role in the world, and then using that vehicle, that alumni association vehicle, to do that. So by bringing this to close off the story, to bringing that back to my law school today and my students, that's my goal with my students. I am not just trying to teach my students leadership skills. I want to get my students to change who they are.
Now that's powerful. And another powerful aspect, I think, from the anecdote that you just shared is sometimes when you make those decisions, people are going to walk away. And there's a risk, and it's scary sometimes because you expect that when you're a good leader, people are going to rally around you. There's going to be this kumbaya and applause. But sometimes effective leadership means alienating people, means making hard decisions that people will not be happy about. Now, how do you find that balance?
So you have to focus in the first place on what for shorthand purposes we'll call emotional intelligence. You have to, so EQ, right, which is a field of psychology research and psychology practice that has become simplified in Harvard Business Review articles and so forth. But it's a real phenomenon. And what it starts with is, again, self-awareness about how your presence and actions in the world affect other people. So where are we starting? We're talking about conflict management, right? The idea that some decisions and statements will irritate people, alienate people, reinforce existing hostilities, or create new ones. And you have to be prepared for that. And you have to be prepared to cope with and manage and somehow respond to that. Again, anticipating what's likely to happen is a big step one. And anticipating is part of your emotional intelligence, right? So again, in my course, I can only give my students a very preliminary introduction to the idea of emotional intelligence. People have different experiences coming into law school and will have different experiences coming out of it. But I want to make them aware that this is a really critical part of their portfolio. If they want to be effective conflict resolvers or participate in effective conflict resolution systems, right? Emotional intelligence has to be very high on the priority list of skills to cultivate. Most law schools, most of the time, don't talk about this at all, right? Most law schools, most of the time, are focused entirely on the analytic side of the line. And I'm talking about a systematic approach to emotional awareness, emotional understanding for yourself and in social context.
It sounds like an overhaul is overdue.
Well, American legal education has been operating on the same model for essentially 150 years. So I think it's time.
You know, the more that we hear from you, Mike, I think the more it's clear that you have a calling.
I do. I mean, so my challenge is that, as you can hear in my descriptions, I am passionate about this. I feel very, very strongly that this should be a big priority in legal education, not only in law schools, but in legal education that continues throughout the careers of practitioners. And it should extend beyond law. This is not something that should be limited just to law and lawyers. This is something that should be included in professional education across the board. It could be included in undergraduate curricula. You can even do it, in high schools, and it's not, you have to adapt it to suit the emotional development and equipment of people at different ages. You have to adapt it in different cultural settings so that it doesn't come across simply as a bunch of Americans talking to a bunch of Americans. But it does transcend the limitations of legal education. And the longer I do this, the more I see how important it is. My challenge is that I'm still very, very passionate about my career as a teacher of other things and a researcher of other things as well. So I do have sort of multiple identities in my role as a law professor.
Well, your comment about Americans speaking to Americans prompted me to ask. So we think about leadership. We think about leadership as a generic thing across borders as well. So when you talk about teaching a leadership course, how much of it is transferable as it is, and how much of it needs to be adapted to a different environment across different borders?
I'll answer the question this way. When I teach my students, and this was true when we were doing our leadership development in my alumni role separately, the way to make the material vivid and effective and to make it durable is to make the material live in the experience of the students. So I try to do this by example. So I told you the anecdote of my high school soccer coach. I share that with my students. I share my own pathway into leadership education. And then I turn it around and I say to my students, okay, tell me about your leadership experiences. And my students will often say, well, I've never had any leadership experiences. And I said, well, wait a minute. You know, were you in the marching band? Were you in the school play? Did you have a part-time job? And so as you start to do the biographies of law students, practicing lawyers, people in the community, what you almost always hear is that people have had experiences in their lives that they didn't think of as leadership experiences, but you can transform their perspective into, oh, wait a minute. I had the lead in the school play, or I was the section leader of the marching band, or I was the editor of the paper, or I supervised a team of salespeople when I was running the gas station, or something that seems very mundane, but it calls on leadership experiences. And if you can do that with anybody in any setting, right? I can talk to people in the UK or in France or Italy or Australia or Singapore, and I can have a version of that conversation. So long as people are willing to open up and talk about themselves, I can have that conversation. And then I can take the material that they share and I can point out how that experience that they have is relevant to understanding their capabilities as leaders. So I've taken the research and the readings that come from different sources, and I transpose those not just in a different cultural setting, but I transpose those into the lived experiences of people.
Go ahead.
No, I just say you can do that with essentially anybody, so long as you've got, no language barriers.
Is there anything else about leadership tools and skills you think it's important for our listeners to know about?
Well, the one big thing I do want to make sure we talk about briefly and explicitly is the idea that leadership is not associated with a specific title or a specific role, right? So oftentimes we take the dean of the law school is the leader, or the managing partner of the law firm is the leader, et cetera, which it's very important, well-functioning organization that those people do have good leadership skills. Often they don't. But just because you're not in a position with a title doesn't mean you cannot actively benefit from and use good leadership skills in your own worlds. So the idea of leadership is a way of increasing the agency, the power and capability of anybody in the world. And that I want to make sure my students leave Pitt Law School with an improved sense of who they are, what they're capable of achieving or doing, whatever it is that might be.
Thank you. So power, let's talk about power. In your course, there's perhaps no subject that is as extensively covered. I think you use 4 classes to talk about power. Why is that so important?
Well, because both in a systems structural sense and also in a very one-to-one interpersonal sense, power is the elephant in the room. Power of different sorts, power in systems, power between people, defines our baseline capabilities and opportunities. And often that happens in ways that we're not fully aware of. So the first question with power is, where does it come from? How does it affect our opportunities, and how does it limit our potential, and what can we do about those things? It's not always true that we can do a lot about those things. Sometimes it's a matter of resilience. Sometimes it's a matter of accommodation. Sometimes it's a matter of patience. Sometimes it's a matter of resistance. But the first thing to do is to have a good capability for diagnosing power and power relations. Power could come from economic structures, it can come from technology structures, it can come from race or gender and other forms of identity and history. Power comes at you from lots and lots of different places, and being able to see that is a really critical part of being a good leader, an effective leader, and avoiding mistakes and worse.
So is an effective leader one that is able to amass power, which seems to be the way of the world? You want to get as much power as possible, or is it to give away power? You give this example of the woman and Girl Scouts that really teaches people, inspires people, is the phrase they use, and so empowers people to do what they do. Or is there some third way?
Well, amassing power is typically kind of a cynical, negative way to understand leadership, right? Simply amassing power for power's sake leads to corruption, leads to abuse, leads to worse and worse things often. I'm not sure that I would characterize the reverse as giving power away. I think that may not be quite the way I would characterize sort of the role of effective leadership. So empowering people obviously is a phrase that gets used a lot. I'm not a big fan of empowering people. It's more, to me, good leadership or effective leadership means creating a sense of agency and actual capabilities in people so that people can develop their own vision, strategies, tactics, objectives, and then have the tools accessible to them that allow them to achieve whatever goals that they set for themselves, which is a form of power. I just think I prefer not to label that process power. I prefer to focus on the actual forms of agency and capabilities. So power has a kind of a values dimension to it. Power has a functional dimension to it. And so in the seminar, I spend some time, for example, talking about the history of the legal profession and how the contemporary forms of law practice, law firms, and other legal institutions, where they came from, and the money and the hierarchies and elite law schools and other things that went into the legal system as we know it today. And I also spend time talking with students about technology systems and the role of both giant and small scale information technologies and the people who are building and operating information technology systems, because those play such important roles in society at large and in the legal profession as well, right? So to see the relationship, I want my students to see the relationship between their own identities, their own capabilities, and some key aspects of the context in which they are going to use their law degrees.
Interesting. So when you think about power and at the end of the day, is it a misunderstood concept?
It is sometimes an overused concept, I think, particularly in the hands. There's a cohort of researchers from various traditions for whom the concept of power is the ultimate explanatory variable. So if you want to understand what's wrong with the world, look at power relations. That explains everything that you need to know. To me, that's not enough. That's not nuanced enough. It has a hint of ideology rather than empiricism. So power is an important feature of our world, but I think it's important to look at power relations from an empirical standpoint, which includes history, which includes philosophy, as well as matters on the ground. And then to see other things that are also affecting the condition that we all experience. I'm just temperamentally resistant to overgeneralization.
So is the ideal state of affairs primus inter partes, first amongst equals? The Washingtonian picture of power.
Well, it depends on the context, right? So for example, I'm going to switch gears in my head a little bit from the conversation about leadership to my scholarly research, which focuses on community-based governance and what I call, and my colleagues call, knowledge commons, or the idea of information sharing, cultural resource sharing. So for people who aren't familiar with this, it's the idea that Wikipedia is a productive environment for producing a collaborative information resource or open source computer software. And so in the social science literature, in the sociology, economics, political science, there's this idea of bottom-up social norms associated with communities, right? So, there's this idealized version of American society in particular that says local community volunteer organizations are the glue that holds American societies together. We've got soccer leagues and the Scouts, and we've got parent-teacher associations and all kinds of local volunteer organizations that are really sort of the essence of this bottom-up social organization of the US. And there's a somewhat sort of complementary but different perspective on all that says, if you look carefully at these local voluntary organizations in the US, it's not simply a community of peers. It's not. It's not that a bunch of people in the neighborhood just got together and decided to have a soccer league. You need structure, you need an organization, you need some form of role and responsibility, and yes, maybe you need some kind of hierarchy. Because that's how things get done. And if you're actually interested in the empirics of how things are getting done, you can take this bottom-up point of view, but you have to add in the idea that to cooperate, people need to have a kind of system. So, first among equals doesn't quite capture the details because every context is going to be a little bit different. Right. I was very involved in youth soccer, not only as a player, but also as a coach and as a referee over years and years. And so anybody who's done volunteer activities at any scale has seen a version of this, like pure peer engagement, even in something like Wikipedia, which is the stereotypical peer-produced thing. There's a social system inside there, and people who are Wikipedians, who are actively editing and creating Wikipedia entries, they know this. It's how Wikipedia functions. So, leadership partly means exercising leadership skills wherever you are, but it means being aware of the context of where you are. Like, what's your role, capability, and responsibility in that organizational setting, neighborhood, law practice, community, politics, whatever it might be. What is your freedom or limitation of freedom in terms of how you can exercise your responsibility and skills?
So that responsibility as a leader, and this goes to my final theme, maybe my final question, but I'll reserve that depending on what comes out after this. Because if it's fun, I'm not going to censor myself and limit myself to that. Collaboration and teamwork. Is the role of a leader one of a coordinator? Is that what you're thinking about when you have this topic of collaboration and teamwork in your course, or is that something more than that?
Well, it could be that, right? So the role of the leader could be sort of an orchestrator. So I have a good friend, for example, who is a symphony conductor. He's had a long career. He's a very successful professional symphony conductor, right? So this doesn't sound like law at all, but I interviewed him for my podcast because I was interested in the role of the symphony conductor as a leader. And anybody who's interested should go track down the episode of the Future Law podcast where I interviewed my friend Scott Speck.
Well, if you send it to me, I'll include the link in there.
I will send you this link because Scott talked very thoughtfully and persuasively about how the role of the symphony conductor is to get the different sections of the symphony to listen to one another. Right, to get the strings to listen to the horns, to listen to the timpani, so that they all harmonize, literally, in service of the conductor's vision for how that particular piece should be performed. Right, so it's a coordination manner, right? That's the leader's role in that context of a symphony. Now, sometimes it's not, a symphony conductor typically is given the symphony. The symphony conductor may not have a role in selecting the members of the symphony. Symphony conductor simply has the players and has to get them to play well together, right? Some leaders have active roles in deciding who's on the team, right? So now it's a matter of talent management, right? In the language of change management, people like John Cotter and Jim Collins, it's who's on the bus and who's off the bus. How do you get people off the bus who should be off the bus? How do you get people on the bus who should be on the bus? How do you get the people on the bus in the right seats on the bus? Right. So we're going to go crazy with this metaphor, but the point is that you're operating in a selecting the team mode, not just coordinating or inspiring the team mode. And so depending on the organization and its needs and the opportunity, leaders might have more than one function. So again, it requires being very attentive to organizational history, organizational purpose, mission, strategy, the role that the leader is performing given that context. Emotional intelligence goes into that. You have to be attentive and listening to understand your leadership opportunity, listening for sources of resistance and conflict. We talked about that. Measuring whether the bus is headed in the right direction. So are the people on the bus driving the bus? Now I'm going to imagine the movie Speed with Sandra Bullock. Are you driving the bus in the right direction, or are you driving the bus off a cliff? Right. And as a leader, can you steer in a different direction, or do you need a different bus? Right. So the metaphors get a little crazy. I recognize that. But the point is that there's no single role of a leader when it comes to teamwork. There's multiple opportunities for a leader to exercise leadership capabilities in a collaboration setting.
Thank you. Boy, what a feast. No, not just food for thought, but what a feast. I'm going to give you the last word, Mike, and just ask you if there's anything else about leadership, about Mike Madison, that our listeners, our viewers should know about.
I guess one last thing, which is that I am not unique in American law schools in focusing on leadership and teaching leadership to law students. There is a community of us around the US, and I assume elsewhere around the world in law, who are interested in cultivating this in legal education. Most of the other folks that I know, at least in the US, focus on leadership for law students as a subsector of ethics and professional responsibility, right? So for many people who teach leadership to lawyers, the question is, how does leadership help somebody become a more ethical practicing professional? That's a really important question. I don't take that approach because to me, the leadership is a broader, bigger, more multifaceted question and a broader source of opportunity and impact for anybody in law. So I don't teach it as a form of legal ethics. I don't teach it as a form of professional responsibility. And so I am part of this community of leadership teachers, but I am sort of on the side a little bit because I have this different pathway in. I am not a teacher of legal ethics. I was a practicing leader in a different volunteer setting, and that's what got me interested in this. And that's what gives me this different vision of what leadership means and can do for our students. So right now I'm out here is why I share my materials openly on the website, because to the best of my ability, through a podcast, through social media, through other means, I want to share what I'm doing. Get reactions and responses, not only from my students, but from other people who take an interest in this, help me improve it, help me refine it, help me expand it and extend it, help build my network of people who are interested in this angle on leadership, whether they come from law, which would be great, or they might come from management, or they might come from medicine, or they might come from social work or education or computer engineering or many, many other fields where the same set of questions and the same set of challenges and the same set of leadership ideas could have a big impact.
Well, thank you, Mike Madison, law professor and leadership whisperer. So glad that you could join us for this Leadership Profiles and Leadership podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daryl.